A single helicopter blade cuts through humid air above Saigon as panic floods the embassy roof. Below, tanks breach palace gates while, nearby, flames devour years of secrets. April 30th, 1975. The fall of Saigon, America's longest war, ends in chaos, televised for the world to witness. But to grasp how the most powerful nation on earth was humbled by guerrillas in sandals, we must go back. Vietnam, once a land of empires and resistance, became the graveyard of foreign ambition. French, Japanese, American. This is the story of how a people who had never known peace refused to accept permanent war, how technology met its match in human will, and how a conflict that began with opium and rubber would end with napalm and Agent Orange, leaving scars that time cannot heal. A war broadcast nightly, its horror unforgettable, its lessons still unsettled. Long before the jungle burned with napalm, it groaned beneath French boots and whispered of freedom. The humid air of Saigon harbor hung thick with possibility on that September morning, in 1858, when Admiral Charles Rigaud de Genouilly's gunboats emerged from the South China Sea like iron harbingers of a new age. Their cannons gleamed in the tropical sun, their tricolour flags snapped in the monsoon breeze, and their holds carried not merely soldiers and supplies, but the weight of European ambition that would reshape a civilization. The fishermen who scattered from the Saigon River as these metal leviathans approached could not have imagined that they were witnessing the first act of a drama that would consume their homeland for the next century. What began as a punitive expedition to protect Catholic missionaries would metastasize into something far more rapacious: the systematic conquest and exploitation of an entire peninsula. Emperor Napoleon III, intoxicated by visions of empire that stretched from the African deserts to the Asian deltas, had dispatched his admirals to carve out a domain in the east. The pretext was noble: defending Catholic converts from persecution by the Vietnamese court. The reality was more prosaic. France needed territories to match British power, and Indochina represented virgin territory ripe for Western development. By 1884, the conquest was complete, though the word conquest hardly captured the methodical dismantling of a millennium-old civilization. French Indochina emerged from the diplomatic conferences as a neat administrative unit comprising 3 Vietnamese regions: Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochinchina in the south, alongside Cambodia and later Laos. On European maps, these territories appeared as orderly blocks of pink, their boundaries drawn with the precision that cartographers reserved for discussing other people's homelands. The reality on the ground proved infinitely more complex, more violent, and more tragic. Imperial rule transformed Vietnam from a rice-growing society into an industrial extraction machine designed to enrich distant shareholders who had never felt tropical rain or tasted nuoc mam. Rubber plantations sprawled across cleared forests like geometric scars, their neat rows of trees tended by Vietnamese laborers working under conditions that differed from slavery primarily in their legal terminology. The Michelin estates alone covered hundreds of thousands of acres, their white sap flowing into metropolitan tires, while their Vietnamese tappers died of malaria, exhaustion, and deliberate neglect at rates that would have scandalized European factory inspectors. Rice, the grain that had sustained Vietnamese civilization for millennia, became another weapon in the imperial arsenal. Overseas administrators transformed Vietnam's deltas into export-oriented plantations, where Vietnamese farmers grew food they could no longer afford to eat. The statistics told a story that no amount of civilizing rhetoric could obscure. Under metropolitan dominion, per capita, Rice consumption among Vietnamese dropped by 20%, even as exports to France increased fourfold. Famine became a regular visitor to villages that had fed themselves for centuries, while French merchants grew wealthy shipping Vietnamese grain to European markets. The taxation system represented administrative sadism elevated to high art. Poll taxes, salt monopolies, and alcohol levies drained money from a population that lived largely outside the cash economy, forcing subsistence farmers to sell their labor to French enterprises at starvation wages. The opium monopoly proved particularly lucrative, generating revenues that funded the administration while creating a dependent population of addicts who required constant doses of the drug that France imported from other parts of its empire. By 1910, opium sales provided 1/3 of Indochina's budget. Blood money extracted from the veins of the subjugated. Education became another instrument of cultural dismemberment. French schools, accessible only to a tiny elite, taught Vietnamese children to despise their own heritage while worshipping European civilization. Students learned about our ancestors, the Gauls, while their own history disappeared from official curricula. The lucky few who mastered French well enough to serve the administration found themselves trapped between two worlds, too westernized to return to traditional Vietnamese society, too Asian to be accepted as equals by their Western masters. This educated class would later provide many of the leaders who would drive France from Indochina, their insurrectionist fervor sharpened by intimate knowledge of imperial hypocrisy. Traditional Vietnamese institutions withered under the systematic assault of modernization. The Mandarin system that had governed Vietnam for centuries was replaced by French bureaucrats who understood neither Vietnamese culture nor local conditions. Village councils that had managed local affairs for generations found their authority superseded by Paris-appointed functionaries who answered to distant superiors rather than local needs. Even the Vietnamese language began to disappear from official use as French became the lingua franca of government, commerce, and higher education. Yet oppression creates its own opposition, and Vietnamese defiance began almost immediately after the first French soldiers stepped ashore. Early uprisings flickered across the countryside like brush fires, quickly suppressed but never completely extinguished. The scholar Phan Dinh Phung organized guerrilla bands in the mountains of Annam, preaching a mixture of Confucian virtue and anti-foreign resistance that attracted thousands of followers before French columns finally hunted him down in 1896. These early rebels lacked coordination and modern weapons, but they established a tradition of opposition that would prove impossible to eradicate. The Can Vuong movement of the 1880s and 1890s represented the most sustained early challenge to French rule. When the French deposed Emperor Ham Nghi in 1885, scholars and mandarins throughout Vietnam rallied to the cry of "Aid the King" and launched a decentralized insurgency that required years of French operations to suppress. Villages that had never seen a European suddenly found themselves occupied by columns of foreign legionnaires, their inhabitants subjected to collective punishment for harboring rebels they had never met. The movement's failure demonstrated that traditional Vietnamese structures could not effectively challenge modern European martial technology. But it also showed that Vietnamese nationalism possessed deeper roots than French administrators had imagined. Religious defiance proved equally persistent and arguably more significant for the future. Vietnamese Buddhism, suppressed in favor of French-sponsored Catholicism, went underground but never disappeared. Buddhist monasteries became centers of cultural preservation and increasingly seditious activity. The Cao Dai and Hoa Hao sects that emerged in the early 20th century blended religious mysticism with anti-Western sentiment, creating mass movements that French police could monitor but never control. These syncretic religions provided organizational frameworks that would later prove invaluable to communist organizers seeking to build rural support networks. The emergence of Vietnamese nationalism as a coherent force required the paradoxical intervention of French education itself. Young Vietnamese who studied in French schools or traveled to France for higher education encountered European ideas, democracy, socialism, nationalism, that provided intellectual frameworks for challenging imperial rule. They read Rousseau and Marx, Voltaire and Lenin, absorbing concepts of popular sovereignty and class struggle that they would later deploy against their teachers. Among these Western-educated revolutionaries, one figure would prove particularly consequential for Vietnam's future. Nguyen Sinh Cuong, born in 1890 in the central Vietnamese province of Nghệ An, grew up listening to his father denounce French injustice and extol Vietnamese heroes of defiance. The boy who would become Ho Chi Minh absorbed anti-imperial sentiment with his mother's milk, but his education began in earnest when he left Vietnam in 1911 as a mess cook aboard a French passenger liner. His wanderings took him from Marseille to New York, from London to Paris, exposing him to the full spectrum of Western civilization, its achievements and contradictions, its ideals and hypocrisies. Working as a kitchen assistant in the basement of the Carlton Hotel in London, he observed the pampered luxury of imperial elites while laboring in conditions that would have been familiar to any Vietnamese plantation worker. The contrast between European rhetoric about civilizing missions and the reality of how Europeans treated their subjects became a central theme of his emerging consciousness. Paris, in the aftermath of World War I, provided the perfect laboratory for a young insurgent seeking to understand how empires could be challenged and defeated. The city teemed with subjects from across the French Empire, Algerians, Senegalese, Cambodians, all seeking to extract concrete benefits from Woodrow Wilson's fine words about self-determination. Ho Chi Minh, now calling himself Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot, threw himself into the ferment of anti-imperial politics with the intensity of a man who had found his life's work. His petition to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 marked his debut on the international stage. Dressed in a rented morning coat and speaking French with the precision of a court clerk, he presented the assembled diplomats with an 8-point program for Vietnamese self-rule that was a model of moderation. He asked not for independence, but for basic rights: freedom of speech, press and assembly, representation in the French Parliament, equality before the law. The great powers ignored his petition completely, teaching him a lesson about the gap between Western ideals and Western interests that would shape his strategy for the next 50 years. Rejection by liberal democracy drove Nguyen Ai Quoc toward more radical alternatives. He joined the French Communist Party in 1920, attracted not primarily by Marxist economic theory, but by Lenin's analysis of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. Soviet communism offered what Western liberalism had denied: a systematic critique of empire linked to a strategy for change. When he left France for Moscow in 1924, the future Ho carried with him both a European education in theory and a Vietnamese peasant's intimate knowledge of exploitation. The Comintern training he received in Moscow transformed a self-taught agitator into a professional insurgent. He studied Marx and Lenin, attended lectures on strategy and underground organization, and met communist leaders from around the world. But the most important lesson he learned was patience, that successful revolts required decades of careful preparation, not romantic gestures or premature uprisings. This lesson would serve him well during the long struggle ahead. China, in the 1920s, provided Ho Chi Minh with his first opportunity to apply Comintern training to Asian conditions. Working as an advisor to the Kuomintang during its period of cooperation with the Communist Party, he observed firsthand how Chinese revolutionaries adapted European theories to Asian realities. The importance of peasant support, the techniques of guerrilla warfare, the art of building united fronts against foreign occupiers. All these lessons would prove invaluable when he returned to Vietnam. His founding of the Vietnamese Communist Party in Hong Kong in February 1930 represented the culmination of nearly 2 decades of education. The party's manifesto reflected his sophisticated understanding of Vietnamese conditions. It called for national independence, democratic government, and socialist economic development. But it also recognized that Vietnamese revolution would require mass peasant support and anti-imperialist unity. Unlike earlier Vietnamese movements that had relied on traditional elites or urban intellectuals, Ho's party was designed from the beginning to mobilize the rural majority that French rule had impoverished and brutalized. The timing proved prophetic. The global economic depression that began in 1929 hit French Indochina with devastating force, as demand for Vietnamese rice and rubber collapsed while taxes remained constant. Rural uprisings erupted across central and northern Vietnam, beginning with strikes in French-owned factories and spreading to peasant revolts in the countryside. The Yen Bai uprising of February 1930 saw Vietnamese soldiers mutiny against their French officers, while Soviet councils briefly controlled entire districts in Nha An and Ha Tinh provinces. French repression was swift and merciless. Planes bombed villages suspected of harboring rebels, while Foreign Legion units swept through the countryside, arresting anyone connected to communist organizations. By 1932, over 10,000 Vietnamese prisoners filled French jails, including most of the Communist Party's leadership. Ho Chi Minh himself was captured by British police in Hong Kong and spent 2 years fighting extradition to France, where a death sentence awaited him. Yet this savage crackdown paradoxically strengthened Vietnamese communism by eliminating moderate alternatives and proving that French rule rested ultimately on naked force. The educated Vietnamese, who might have sought gradual reform within the system, were driven underground or into exile, while peasants who had experienced French pacification campaigns understood that their oppressors recognized no limits on their use of violence. The Communist Party that emerged from this crucible was harder, more disciplined, and more committed to change than the organization that had entered it. The decade of the 1930s witnessed a gradual rebuilding of networks, despite continued French surveillance and repression. Working through legal organizations, labor unions, cultural associations, Buddhist temples, communist organizers slowly reconstructed their underground apparatus. They learned to speak in codes, communicate through intermediaries, and maintain compartmentalized cells that could survive the arrest of individual members. Most importantly, they began the patient work of building support among the rural population that would provide the human foundation for armed defiance. French policy during this period inadvertently aided communist recruitment by demonstrating the hollowness of reform. The Popular Front government that came to power in France in 1936 promised greater self-rule for Indochina, but the changes it implemented were cosmetic modifications that left the essential structure of exploitation intact. Vietnamese who had hoped for gradual improvement through legal channels found themselves still excluded from meaningful participation, still subject to arbitrary arrest, and still powerless to protect their communities from economic predation. World War II transformed Vietnamese nationalism from an aspiration into a necessity. When France fell to Germany in 1940, the administration in Indochina faced an impossible choice: collaborate with Nazi-allied Vichy France or resist German pressure and risk invasion. The decision to accept Japanese occupation while maintaining French control created a surreal situation where Vietnamese subjects found themselves ruled simultaneously by European fascists and Asian militarists, both of whom treated Indochina as a source of raw materials for their respective war efforts. Japanese occupation brought new forms of exploitation that made even French rule seem benevolent by comparison. Japanese commanders requisitioned rice for their armies, while Vietnamese peasants starved, creating famines that killed over 1 million people in the northern provinces alone. Forced labor programs conscripted hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese workers for construction projects, while Japanese propaganda about Asian liberation rang hollow in villages where Japanese soldiers behaved with casual brutality toward Vietnamese civilians. These conditions provided Ho Chi Minh with the opportunity he had spent 3 decades preparing to seize. Returning to Vietnam in 1941, after 30 years of exile, he established his headquarters in caves near the Chinese border and began building the organization that would drive both Japanese and French forces from Vietnamese soil. The Viet Minh, the League for Vietnamese Independence, represented his masterpiece of organization, a united front that included non-communist nationalists, but was controlled by disciplined communist cadres who understood their ultimate objectives. The genius of the Viet Minh lay in its ability to present itself as a purely nationalist organization while maintaining a rigorous communist core. Village-level Viet Minh committees included local notables, Buddhist monks, and small farmers, alongside communist activists, creating the impression of broad-based popular support, while ensuring that key decisions remained in the hands of party members. This strategy allowed Ho Chi Minh to mobilize Vietnamese patriotism for communist objectives, without triggering the kind of ideological opposition that had hampered earlier communist efforts. Martial organization proceeded alongside political mobilization. Vo Nguyen Giap, a former history teacher who had learned strategy from French textbooks and Chinese advisors, began training small guerrilla units in the mountains of northern Vietnam. These early Viet Minh forces numbered in the hundreds rather than thousands, but they represented something new in Vietnamese defiance. A disciplined organization trained in modern tactics and linked to a sophisticated apparatus. The Japanese coup of March 1945 eliminated French rule throughout Indochina and created the power vacuum that Ho Chi Minh had been waiting for. When Japanese authorities removed French administrators and declared Vietnamese independence under the puppet emperor Bao Dai, they inadvertently legitimized the concept of Vietnamese self-rule while demonstrating their own weakness. As Japan's Pacific Empire collapsed, the Viet Minh emerged from the mountains and jungles to claim power in the name of the Vietnamese people. The August Revolution of 1945 represented one of the most successful takeovers in modern history. Within weeks of Japan's surrender, Viet Minh committees controlled most of Vietnam's provinces, while Ho Chi Minh's forces occupied the capital city of Hanoi. The Emperor Bao Dai abdicated in favor of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, lending legitimacy to Ho's provisional government. Mass rallies in cities and towns demonstrated popular support for independence, while the absence of effective opposition showed how thoroughly French dominion had discredited alternative Vietnamese leadership. On September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before 500,000 people in Ba Dinh Square. and proclaimed Vietnamese independence in words deliberately borrowed from the American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The irony was deliberate and profound. A communist using Thomas Jefferson to establish a socialist republic, an Asian peasant invoking Western ideals to justify throwing off Western rule. The speech lasted only 20 minutes, but it announced the end of French Indochina and the beginning of a new phase in the global struggle against empire. Yet even as Ho Chi Minh savored this moment of triumph, he understood that declaring independence and achieving it were very different things. French forces were already returning to southern Vietnam, while Chinese nationalist troops occupied the northern provinces. The great powers had divided Indochina into occupation zones without consulting Vietnamese opinion, treating the country's independence as a temporary wartime expedient rather than a permanent fact. The easy phase of the Vietnamese Revolution was ending. The difficult work of defending independence against the world's fourth largest power was about to begin. Imperial rule had forged Vietnam in the furnace of exploitation and defiance, creating both the grievances that would fuel decades of warfare and the organizational structures that would make sustained opposition possible. French dominion had destroyed traditional Vietnamese society, but had failed to create a stable alternative, leaving behind a population that was educated enough to understand its oppression, but powerless to change it through legal means. The Communist Party that emerged from this crucible possessed both the ideological framework to explain Vietnamese suffering and the discipline to channel it into effective action. More importantly, the system had created Ho Chi Minh himself, a figure who combined Vietnamese peasant cunning with European intellectual sophistication, who understood both Western strengths and Western weaknesses, who could speak the language of international diplomacy while commanding the loyalty of illiterate farmers. His 30-year education in the realities of imperialism had prepared him for the struggle ahead, teaching him that Vietnamese independence would require not just victory, but the systematic mobilization of an entire people in a war that would test every aspect of their civilization. The French, preparing to return to their former possession, brought with them assumptions about Vietnamese capacity that their own policies had rendered obsolete. They expected to face the same kind of traditional opposition that they had crushed in the 1880s and 1930s. Localized uprisings led by traditional elites and lacking both modern organization and broad popular support. Instead, they would encounter something entirely new. A disciplined movement that had learned to combine Western organizational techniques with Asian guerrilla traditions, that commanded genuine popular support among the rural majority, and that was led by a man who understood European civilization well enough to exploit its weaknesses and contradictions. Before America, before the bombs, before the jungle caught fire, a quiet man in a cave had written a declaration of independence that would reshape the balance of power in Asia and challenge the foundations of the global system. The revolution that began in the caves of northern Vietnam would eventually draw in the world's greatest powers, consume millions of lives, and alter the course of the 20th century. But it began with the simple recognition that French rule had created its own gravediggers, that empire had forged the very instruments that would destroy it, and that the age of Western dominance in Asia was drawing to a close. The French thought the war would be short. The Viet Minh had other plans. In the grand salons of Paris, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on silk wallpaper, diplomats sipped champagne and spoke confidently of restoring order to their wayward colony. They had returned to Indochina with modern armaments, seasoned officers, and the unshakable conviction that European military science would quickly subdue what they dismissed as a peasant uprising. The maps spread across mahogany tables showed Vietnam divided into neat operational zones, each marked with precise troop dispositions and supply routes. What these maps could not show was the network of caves, tunnels, and jungle paths, where Ho Chi Minh's guerrillas were preparing for a conflict unlike any the world had ever seen. The negotiations that preceded the shooting began with such promise that even skeptics dared to hope for peace. In March 1946, Jean Saint-Denis, France's chief representative, met with Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi to discuss the future of Vietnam within the Metropolitan Union. The communist leader, now styling himself President of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, arrived at these talks wearing a simple khaki suit and rubber sandals, his wispy beard and gentle manner masking one of the most formidable political minds of the 20th century. For months, the two men circled each other in a diplomatic dance that grew more elaborate, even as it became more futile. Ho Chi Minh understood that time favored his cause. Every day of negotiation allowed his units to consolidate their control over the countryside, to stockpile armaments captured from surrendering Japanese formations, and to build the political networks that would sustain a prolonged struggle. He spoke to Saint-Denis' delegation of autonomy within the Union, of gradual independence, of partnership between East and West. Meanwhile, Vo Nguyen Giap's cadres were organizing peasant militias in remote villages, establishing supply caches in mountain caves, and preparing for the conflict that both sides knew was inevitable. Rather than seeing Ho's flexibility as strategy, the colonial leaders saw it as weakness, assuming the Viet Minh didn't have the muscle to keep resisting for long. They had learned nothing from their recent humiliation by Nazi Germany, nothing from the ongoing struggles in Algeria and Madagascar. The imperial mindset that had governed policy for nearly a century remained intact. Natives might rebel, but they could not ultimately resist the application of superior European firepower, backed by modern logistics and professional leadership. The spark that ignited 8 years of carnage came from an unexpected quarter. In November 1946, a dispute over customs collection in the northern port city of Haiphong escalated when naval units shelled local positions, killing thousands of civilians. The bombardment lasted hours, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble, while officers watched through binoculars from the safety of their warships. General Jean-Étienne Vallouis, commander of metropolitan troops in Tonkin, had intended to demonstrate overwhelming superiority. Instead, he provided Ho Chi Minh with the propaganda victory that would transform a localized political dispute into a war of national liberation. On the evening of December 19th, 1946, the Viet Minh struck back with synchronized assaults across Hanoi and several other major cities. European civilians enjoying dinner in their villas suddenly found their compounds under assault by fighters who seemed to materialize from the darkness itself. The electricity failed, plunging the capital into blackness, broken only by muzzle flashes and burning buildings. Reinforcements rushing to aid besieged positions discovered that roads had been mined, bridges demolished, and communication lines severed with surgical precision. Within 72 hours, the Viet Minh had vanished from the cities as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind a trail of destruction that announced the beginning of a new kind of warfare. Colonial troops controlled the urban centers and major transportation routes, but the countryside had become a vast question mark, where European authority extended no further than the range of their artillery. The conflict that would consume the next 8 years had begun with this tactical masterstroke that demonstrated both Viet Minh capabilities and metropolitan vulnerabilities. General Valois' initial assessment reflected the confidence of a professional soldier who had fought in 2 world wars and numerous imperial campaigns. His formations numbered over 100,000 men, including crack Foreign Legion units, Moroccan and Senegalese infantry, and modern armor and artillery. Against this professional army stood perhaps 60,000 Viet Minh regulars, equipped with a mixture of captured Japanese rifles, antiquated firearms, and homemade explosives. By every conventional military calculation, the outcome should have been decided within months. The calculations proved worthless because they failed to account for the revolution in combat that the Viet Minh had already accomplished. This was not the imperial uprising that strategists expected, localized violence led by traditional elites seeking to restore an outdated political order. Instead, Giap had created something unprecedented, a people's army that drew its strength not from professional training or superior equipment, but from the active aid of millions of peasants who had been transformed by decades of exploitation into conscious participants in their own liberation. Every village became part of a vast intelligence web, turning the countryside into the Viet Minh's most valuable resource for tracking city operations. Farmers who appeared to be harvesting rice were actually observing patrol routes and counting vehicles. Children playing in fields served as messengers, carrying coded information across vast distances. Women carrying produce to market concealed ammunition and medical supplies beneath their vegetables. The Europeans found themselves fighting not just an army, but an entire population that had been militarized without appearing to be militarized. Colonial tactics, refined through decades of European warfare and imperial pacification, proved not just inadequate, but counterproductive in this new environment. The conventional responses to guerrilla activity, sweeping through suspected areas with large formations, establishing fortified positions to control key terrain, using superior firepower to destroy enemy concentrations, only deepened local hostility while failing to achieve their objectives. Every heavy-handed operation created new recruits for the Viet Minh, while demonstrating to wavering villagers that their masters recognized no distinction between combatants and civilians. Chinese intervention in 1949 transformed an imperial insurgency into a proxy conflict that would define the emerging Cold War struggle. When Mao Zedong's communist armies reached the border, they brought with them military advisors, modern armaments, and a revolutionary ideology that provided the Viet Minh with resources that no purely indigenous movement could have sustained. The 10,000 Chinese advisors who crossed into northern Vietnam carried more than technical expertise. They brought the lessons learned from defeating both Japanese invaders and nationalist armies in the world's largest guerrilla campaign. Soviet aid, channeled through China to maintain plausible deniability, provided the liberation movement with equipment that began to level the technological playing field. Russian-manufactured artillery pieces, anti-aircraft guns, and small arms appeared in Giap's arsenals with increasing frequency. More importantly, Soviet military doctrine, emphasizing the integration of political and combat objectives, provided the theoretical framework that allowed the Viet Minh to coordinate their guerrilla activities with their diplomatic initiatives and propaganda campaigns. American assistance to France escalated in parallel with communist backing for the Viet Minh, transforming what had begun as an imperial conflict into a global confrontation between competing ideologies. The Truman administration, initially reluctant to aid European imperialism, found itself financing up to 80% of metropolitan military costs by 1954. US armaments, vehicles, and equipment flowed into colonial arsenals, while American advisors helped plan campaigns and train auxiliary formations. The United States had not yet committed its own combat troops, but it had already become the indispensable partner in France's struggle to maintain its Asian empire. The conflict's geographical scope expanded as both sides sought strategic advantages beyond Vietnam's borders. Colonial armies pursued Viet Minh units into Laos and Cambodia, internationalizing the struggle while providing their enemies with new bases and recruitment opportunities. The establishment of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, actually a complex network of paths, roads, and waterways stretching from China through Laos into South Vietnam, created a strategic supply line that interdiction efforts never succeeded in severing. Every attempt to cut these communications only dispersed them into more routes that became harder to monitor and attack. When local auxiliaries began serving the colonial side, it exposed some of the conflict's most painful ironies. The State of Vietnam Army, established under former Emperor Bao Dai, represented France's attempt to create a non-communist alternative to Ho Chi Minh's republic. These units, trained and equipped by metropolitan advisors, but led by indigenous officers, found themselves fighting for a vision of independence that remained subordinate to continued European oversight. Their soldiers faced the psychological burden of opposing fellow countrymen who claimed to represent authentic nationalism while serving foreign masters who promised eventual autonomy but delivered only continued subjugation. The climactic confrontation came in the remote valley of Dien Bien Phu, where strategists believed they had finally created conditions that would allow their superior firepower and professional expertise to achieve decisive victory. General Henri Navarre's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Establish a fortified base in northwestern Vietnam that would block Viet Minh infiltration routes into Laos, while providing an irresistible target that would compel Giap to commit his main units to a conventional engagement, where colonial advantages would prove overwhelming. November 1953 saw an elite force parachute into Dien Bien Phu, some of the best trained and most seasoned troops in the Indochina campaign. The valley floor became a complex of bunkers, artillery positions, and airstrips surrounded by hilltop strongpoints with names like Gabriel, Beatrice, and Isabel. Colonel Christian de Castries commanded over 15,000 men, equipped with artillery, tanks, and guaranteed air cover. Planners calculated that even if the Viet Minh managed to bring significant numbers into the area, they would lack the heavy equipment necessary to reduce prepared fortifications defended by professional soldiers. These calculations failed to account for one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history. Throughout the winter of 1953 to 54, tens of thousands of peasants carried artillery pieces through jungle terrain that experts had declared impassable for heavy equipment. Disassembled cannons were transported on bicycles, modified to carry 500-pound loads. Ammunition moved along human supply chains that stretched for hundreds of miles through some of the most difficult terrain in Southeast Asia. When the siege began in March 1954, Giap had positioned more artillery around the fortress than the garrison possessed, all of it camouflaged in positions that reconnaissance had failed to detect. What unfolded over those 57 days became a powerful emblem of how the war had reshaped the balance of power between European and Asian forces. Colonial artillery, designed to dominate battlefields through superior range and accuracy, found itself outgunned by equipment that should never have reached the theater of operations. The airstrip that was supposed to guarantee resupply came under such accurate fire that transport aircraft could no longer land safely. Air cover, the foundation of tactical doctrine, proved ineffective against targets concealed in positions that had been prepared with extraordinary attention to camouflage and protection. The final collapse came on May 7th, 1954, when the last positions were overrun by Viet Minh assault troops who had sustained casualties that would have broken any army not sustained by absolute conviction in the righteousness of its cause. The white flag that rose over de Castries' command bunker signaled not just the end of a particular engagement, but the death of European imperialism in Asia. The photographs of colonial prisoners being marched into captivity by soldiers who looked like children became symbols of a world where the old hierarchies of race and civilization had been shattered beyond repair. Geneva became the stage for ratifying what the battlefield had already decided. The international conference that convened in May 1954 brought together the great powers to negotiate the future of Indochina under circumstances that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. France, represented by Pierre Mendès France, came to the negotiating table as a defeated power seeking to salvage what it could from the wreckage of its Asian empire. The Viet Minh delegation arrived as the victorious party, but found themselves pressured by their Chinese and Soviet allies to accept a compromise that would prevent the struggle from escalating into a global confrontation. The Geneva Accords that emerged from these negotiations reflected the complex international dimensions that the Indochina struggle had acquired. Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh's government controlling the north and a Western-sponsored administration governing the south. National elections, scheduled for 1956, were supposed to reunify the country under a government chosen by the people themselves. The agreement also established the independence of Laos and Cambodia, ending the union in Indochina and creating 3 sovereign states from what had been a single territory. As Europeans withdrew from northern Vietnam, the resulting exodus became one of modern Asia's largest population movements. Nearly 1 million locals, predominantly Catholics who feared religious persecution under communist rule, fled south in a massive exodus that revealed the depth of the divisions that 8 years of warfare had created within society. The departure of colonial civilians, administrators, and their collaborators marked the end of a century of European presence that had transformed Vietnam's economy, society, and culture in ways that would influence the country's development for generations. For Ho Chi Minh personally, victory brought both vindication and new challenges. The man who had spent 30 years in exile had returned to lead his people to independence against odds that had seemed hopeless when the struggle began. Yet the division of Vietnam at Geneva meant that unification remained incomplete, while the growing American presence in South Vietnam suggested that the fight for independence was far from over. The aging revolutionary, who had outlasted European imperialism, would soon face an even more formidable opponent in the United States, which brought to Southeast Asia resources and determination that dwarfed anything France had been able to mobilize. As the last metropolitan units departed from Hanoi in October 1954, they left behind a country that had been fundamentally altered by 8 years of total conflict. The traditional society that had survived a century of imperial rule had been replaced by a politicized population that understood its capacity to resist foreign domination. The Communist Party that Ho Chi Minh had built in exile now controlled a modern state apparatus capable of mobilizing resources on a national scale. Most ominously for future peace, the division imposed at Geneva had created 2 governments, each claiming to represent the legitimate aspirations of the people. In a valley in the far north, an imperial army died, and the age of empires in Asia died with it. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu marked more than the end of a particular conflict. It announced the beginning of a new era in which the technological advantages that had enabled European expansion would no longer guarantee European dominance. The methods that had brought victory to liberation armies would be studied and adapted around the world, while the example of successful resistance would inspire independence movements from Algeria to Angola. The imperial period was ending, but the violence it had unleashed would continue to shape the modern world for generations to come. The war was not yet American, but it was already inevitable. In the humid aftermath of Geneva, two nations emerged from the ashes of French Indochina, like phoenix birds rising from the same fire, but flying toward different suns. The 17th parallel that divided Vietnam appeared on maps as a thin black line, but on the ground it became an iron curtain that would separate families, fragment communities, and create two entirely different experiments in statehood. To the north, Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic began the arduous task of building a socialist society from the rubble of colonial exploitation. To the south, a new entity called the Republic of Vietnam took shape under Washington's patronage, its capital in Saigon pulsing with the nervous energy of a state that knew its legitimacy depended entirely on foreign protection. The Great Migration that followed partition dwarfed even the population movements that had accompanied Indian independence. Nearly 1 million Northerners, predominantly Catholics who feared persecution under communist rule, streamed south in an exodus that lasted months and strained the resources of both emerging states. US and French ships carried refugees across the parallel, while party cadres slipped south in equal numbers, creating a demographic exchange that ensured neither entity would be ethnically or ideologically homogeneous. Families were torn apart by choices that seemed temporary but would prove permanent, as the promised reunification elections of 1956 receded into the realm of forgotten diplomatic promises. Ngo Diem emerged from this chaos as the unlikely architect of the Southern Republic's future, a Catholic Mandarin in a Buddhist country, a celibate intellectual in a society that prized family above all else. The man possessed an austere dignity that impressed Western officials even as it mystified his own people. His appointment as Prime Minister in 1954 represented Washington's attempt to find a leader who could provide non-communist nationalism with both legitimacy and effectiveness. What they got was a figure whose rigid personality and authoritarian instincts would transform the southern state into a family dictatorship that generated its own opposition. The consolidation of presidential power proceeded with methodical ruthlessness that belied Diem's reputation as a gentle scholar. The sect wars of 1955 saw his US-trained army crush the Cao Dai and Hoa Hao religious militias that had controlled large portions of the Mekong Delta since the Japanese occupation. The Bin Shuyen organized crime syndicate, which had administered Saigon's police force and controlled its lucrative vice districts, found itself outgunned by troops who attacked their headquarters with tanks and artillery. By the end of 1955, the president had eliminated every alternative power center in the South, except the underground resistance, which had prudently avoided direct confrontation while building its strength in remote villages. By ousting Bao Dai and installing himself as president, Diem used the referendum to display his sharp instincts and his willingness to bend democratic rules. The ballot offered voters a choice between the emperor, represented by a green ballot, and the mandarin, represented by red. When the votes were counted, Diem had allegedly received 98.2% support, including impossible majorities in Saigon, where his opponents knew he had substantial opposition. Western advisors who witnessed the electoral fraud chose to overlook it, reasoning that legitimacy in Asia came from effective governance rather than honest elections. This pragmatic accommodation with authoritarian methods would become a recurring theme in the relationship with their protégé. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh faced the different but equally daunting challenge of transforming a guerrilla movement into a functioning state apparatus. The Democratic Republic that emerged from the First Indochina War controlled a territory devastated by 8 years of warfare, populated by peasants who had been mobilized for revolutionary struggle but had little experience with modern administration. The Chinese advisors who had helped win the war now assisted with the transition to socialism, bringing with them both expertise and ideological rigidity that would complicate development for decades. Land reform became the crucible in which the Northern experiment was forged and nearly destroyed. Between 1953 and 1956, party cadres organized people's tribunals in villages throughout the countryside, where peasants were encouraged to denounce landlords and class enemies in sessions that combined revolutionary theater with mob justice. The violence that erupted exceeded even the leadership's expectations, as personal grievances and local conflicts were channeled into ideological categories that justified extreme brutality. An estimated 15,000 landlords and rich peasants were executed, while 100,000 others disappeared into labor camps that had been designed to reform their class consciousness through manual labor. The Nan Van Gyai Pham movement of 1956 represented the intellectual rebellion against this extremism. Writers and artists who had supported the independence struggle found themselves criticized for bourgeois tendencies when they questioned cultural policies or depicted the complexities of rural life with insufficient revolutionary optimism. The crackdown that followed eliminated independent intellectual discourse in the North for a generation, while establishing the principle that artistic expression must serve ideology rather than individual creativity or social criticism. In the Southern Republic, Diem's approach to rural development reflected theories about modernization that had been tested in other Cold War battlegrounds. The Strategic Hamlet program, launched in 1962 with great fanfare and enormous resources, aimed to win hearts and minds by concentrating rural populations in fortified villages where they could be protected from infiltration while receiving modern amenities like schools, medical clinics, and agricultural extension services. On paper, the program promised to address the root causes of rural discontent while denying the Viet Cong access to the peasant recruitment base that had sustained the independence movement. The reality proved far more problematic than the theory. Peasants who had lived for generations in scattered hamlets found themselves forced into artificial communities, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The relocation disrupted traditional farming patterns, separated families from ancestral graveyards, and created refugee camps masquerading as development projects. Of the 8,000 strategic hamlets that officials claimed to have established, fewer than 20% provided genuine security or meaningful improvements in living standards. The program became a symbol of incompetence and foreign interference that drove many rural inhabitants toward the very movement it was designed to defeat. Over time, it became clear that the president's family-run oligarchy was the true force behind the Southern Republic's Democratic Front. His brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, emerged as the regime's enforcer, using his secret police apparatus to eliminate opposition while accumulating personal wealth through corruption and smuggling operations. Madame Nju, his wife, became the public face of the family's growing isolation from society. Her inflammatory statements about Buddhist barbecues and her advocacy of puritanical social reforms, alienating both traditional conservatives and urban modernizers. The Buddhist crisis that erupted in 1963 exposed the fundamental contradictions in Diem's attempt to build a modern state on the foundation of religious and ethnic minorities. when troops fired on Buddhist demonstrators in Hue, who were protesting restrictions on religious flags, they triggered a nationwide movement that challenged not just specific policies, but the legitimacy of Catholic rule over a Buddhist majority. The self-immolation of Tish Quang Duc on a Saigon street corner, captured by photographers and broadcast around the world, became an icon of resistance that no amount of propaganda could neutralize. When the National Liberation Front was formed in December 1960, it signaled the underground movement's shift from quiet plotting to active war. The NLF's founding manifesto carefully avoided ideological rhetoric, focusing instead on nationalist themes that could appeal to non-party opponents of the Diem regime. The organization presented itself as a coalition of patriotic forces seeking to liberate the South from foreign domination and domestic dictatorship, though its leadership structure remained firmly under party control through mechanisms that were invisible to outside observers. Viet Cong, guerrillas, the derogatory term that Southern officials applied to NLF fighters, began with primitive weapons and improvised tactics, but quickly demonstrated their ability to challenge authority throughout the countryside. Their strategy combined organization with military action, establishing liberated zones where they could recruit supporters, collect taxes, and administer their own version of revolutionary rule. By 1963, they controlled substantial portions of the Mekong Delta and maintained a presence in provinces within 50 miles of Saigon itself. US involvement deepened incrementally, as each crisis demanded greater intervention to preserve the strategic investment that previous commitments had created. The 700 military advisors that President Eisenhower had left in the Southern Republic grew to 16,000 under John F. Kennedy's administration, their mission expanding from training local forces to accompanying them on combat operations. The Green Berets and other special forces units that arrived with great secrecy found themselves fighting an undeclared war against an enemy that refused to provide conventional targets for Western firepower and tactical expertise. The coup that overthrew Diem on November 1st, 1963, represented both the culmination of frustration with their ally and the beginning of a deeper involvement that would prove impossible to control. When Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN generals, surrounded the presidential palace and demanded surrender, they acted with the tacit approval of officials who had concluded that the Mandarin's authoritarian methods were obstacles to effective prosecution of the counterinsurgency campaign. The murder of both brothers during their capture shocked even the conspirators who had promised safe passage out of the country in exchange for peaceful surrender. In the wake of Diem's assassination, the instability that gripped the country echoed the fears of those who had opposed his removal. In the 18 months after the coup, the Southern Republic experienced 7 different administrations, as military factions competed for power, while the insurgency expanded its control over rural areas. Each new leadership promised to restore stability and prosecute the war more effectively, but none possessed the base or administrative competence necessary to govern a society that was simultaneously fighting a civil war and undergoing forced modernization. Intelligence estimates during this period revealed the extent to which policymakers had misunderstood the nature of the conflict they were trying to manage. The Viet Cong, initially dismissed as a terrorist organization lacking popular support, had grown into a parallel administration that collected taxes, maintained courts, and provided social services in areas where Saigon's authority existed only on official maps. Their recruiting success among young villagers reflected not just ideological appeal, but also the absence of attractive alternatives in a society where service meant corruption and military conscription meant fighting fellow countrymen on behalf of foreign powers. The transformation of the Southern Republic's urban centers reflected the broader changes that Western involvement had brought to traditional society. Saigon became a boom town, fueled by military spending and populated by refugees from the countryside who had fled both recruitment and relocation programs. The city's French colonial elegance gave way to the garish commercialism of a war economy where dollars bought everything from sexual services to military intelligence. The social dislocation that accompanied this rapid urbanization created fertile ground for extremism among both organizers and religious sectarians. Educational policy became another battleground where competing visions of identity clashed with practical necessities. The Diem regime's emphasis on Catholic schools and Western curricula alienated Buddhist educators while failing to produce the technical specialists that modernization required. Areas under NLF control developed their own educational systems that combined basic literacy with ideological indoctrination, creating a generation of rural inhabitants who understood concepts but lacked the skills necessary for economic development. The result was two separate societies emerging within a single nation, each with its own institutions, values, and vision of the future. The cultural implications of partition extended far beyond politics into the realm of personal identity and family relationships. Traditional society had been organized around extended kinship networks that transcended regional boundaries. But the division at the 17th parallel created legal and physical barriers that gradually severed these connections. Northern families lost contact with southern relatives, while shared cultural practices began to diverge under different systems. The emergence of distinct northern and southern dialects, musical styles, and social customs suggested that temporary partition was becoming permanent separation. International dimensions of the division reflected the broader Cold War competition that had transformed local conflicts into global confrontations. Soviet aid to the Northern Republic provided not just military equipment, but also technical advisors who helped build industrial facilities and transportation networks. Chinese support included both material assistance and ideological guidance, though the relationship between the two communist parties contained tensions that would later explode into open warfare. Western involvement in the South brought similar benefits and complications, as massive aid programs created dependency relationships, while cultural differences generated misunderstandings that undermined cooperation. The intelligence war that accompanied the struggle revealed the sophistication of underground organizational methods and the limitations of conventional counterintelligence techniques. NLF agents penetrated every level of Southern society, from village administrations to the presidential palace itself. Their success reflected not just ideological commitment, but also the advantages that clandestine organizations possessed over established authorities in societies where foreign influence generated nationalist resentment. Western and Southern intelligence services, despite superior technology and resources, never succeeded in matching the human intelligence networks that sustained the resistance movement. By 1963, the temporary division imposed at Geneva had hardened into two separate states, with incompatible systems and irreconcilable visions of identity. Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic had survived land reform violence and industrial development challenges to emerge as a functioning socialist state with genuine popular support, at least among its northern constituency. The Southern Republic of Vietnam had modernized its military and urbanized its society, but had failed to create the legitimacy necessary for long-term survival without foreign protection. The stage was set for escalation as the Kennedy administration's counterinsurgency doctrine proved inadequate to the challenge of building stable rule in a society torn by civil war. The lessons that officials drew from their experience would shape Cold War strategy around the world, while the methods they developed for fighting insurgencies would influence military doctrine for generations. Most ominously, the logic of incremental involvement had created commitments that no president could abandon without appearing to accept defeat in the global struggle against communism. Vietnam was split in two, not just by politics, but by fear, faith, and the promise of reunification that never came. The parallel that had seemed like a temporary expedient in 1954 had become a permanent wound in the body politic, creating two nations from one people, and ensuring that any future reunification would require the destruction of one state by the other. The Americans had not yet fired a shot in anger, but their fingerprints were already everywhere, marking them as participants in a conflict that had transcended its origins to become a test of wills between competing ideologies and incompatible visions of human organization. The summer heat of 1964 hung over the South China Sea like a suffocating blanket, trapping the humidity that made life aboard US warships a daily endurance test. In the waters off North Vietnam, where the 17th parallel met the ocean, USS Maddox cut through swells that reflected the tropical sun like fragments of broken mirror. Captain John Herrick stood on the bridge of his destroyer, watching the coastline of a country that most Americans could not locate on a globe, unaware that he was about to provide President Lyndon Johnson with the justification for a war that would consume a decade, claim millions of lives, and shatter the national consensus about their nation's role in the world. The Gulf of Tonkin incident that erupted on the night of August 4th, 1964, began with radar contacts that might have been patrol boats, phantom blips on sonar screens that could have been waves, and nervous sonar operators who reported torpedo attacks that no one could confirm. In the darkness and confusion of a tropical storm, sailors fired at targets they could not see, while their commanders in Washington transformed ambiguous intelligence into certain knowledge of North Vietnamese aggression. The cable that Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara sent to the White House spoke with confidence about an unprovoked attack on vessels conducting routine patrols in international waters, though later investigations would reveal that the second attack probably never occurred at all. Johnson, a man who understood congressional politics as intimately as a Baptist preacher understood scripture, seized upon the incident to extract from Congress the blank check that would allow him to prosecute an Asian conflict without the constitutional inconvenience of a formal declaration. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution passed the House of Representatives unanimously, and the Senate with only 2 dissenting votes, granting the President authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the United States and to prevent further aggression. In the charged atmosphere of the Cold War, few legislators dared to appear soft on communist expansion, while those who harbored private doubts convinced themselves that Johnson, a cautious politician, would use his new powers sparingly. Johnson ran as the voice of restraint in the 1964 election, contrasting sharply with Goldwater's hardline stance on Vietnam, which alarmed voters mindful of recent brushes with war in Korea and Cuba. "We are not about to send boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves," the president declared to cheering crowds, his Texas drawl conveying the folksy wisdom that had carried him from the hill country to the heights of power. The landslide victory that followed seemed to validate his approach of measured response and graduated pressure. But behind the scenes, his advisors were already planning the escalation that would make those campaign promises seem like cruel deceptions. Vietnam's shift from a small Cold War headache to America's longest war began with Operation Rolling Thunder, the relentless bombing campaign launched in March 1965 by men convinced that air power could succeed where troops and reform had not. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. Carefully calibrated bombing would demonstrate resolve while imposing costs on North Vietnam that would eventually compel Ho Chi Minh to abandon his support for the southern insurgency. Each target was selected with painstaking care. Each sortie planned to send specific messages about intentions and capabilities. The reality proved far more complex than the theory. The bombs that fell on North Vietnam's primitive transportation network created temporary disruptions that ingenuity quickly repaired with materials that bombing could not destroy: human labor, bamboo poles, and the accumulated experience of a people who had been rebuilding their infrastructure under foreign attack for nearly 2 decades. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, that legendary supply route that intelligence never quite understood, adapted to interdiction efforts like a living organism, sprouting new arteries when old ones were severed, and developing redundancies that made it virtually indestructible. Ground combat began almost accidentally, as the 3,500 Marines who landed at Da Nang in March 1965 discovered that defending air bases required controlling the terrain around them, which in turn required offensive operations against an adversary who refused to provide convenient targets for firepower. General William Westmoreland, the Ramrod Strait career officer who commanded Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, understood immediately that his mission had evolved from advising South Vietnamese troops to conducting independent operations against an increasingly sophisticated opposition. The build-up that followed violated every principle of gradual escalation that Johnson's advisors had so carefully crafted. The 23,000 servicemen in Vietnam at the end of 1964 became 184,000 by December 1965, then 385,000 by the end of 1965, 1,966, and finally peaked at over 540,000 in 1968. Each increment seemed reasonable when measured against immediate tactical requirements, but the cumulative effect transformed Vietnam from a minor commitment into the central focus of foreign policy and domestic politics. As the war grew, the draft exposed deep class inequalities that had always lurked behind democratic talk, but never so vividly in questions of survival. College deferments protected the sons of the middle and upper classes, while working-class teenagers found themselves boarding chartered aircraft for the long flight to Southeast Asia. The irony was bitter and inescapable. A conflict fought in the name of democracy was prosecuted primarily by those who lacked the influence to avoid it, while those who would later make policy decisions about its conduct remained safely insulated from its human costs. The adversary that these young soldiers encountered in the jungles and rice paddies bore no resemblance to the communist armies that their fathers had faced in Korea or their grandfathers had fought in the great wars of the 20th century. The Viet Cong were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, capable of materializing from a seemingly peaceful village to launch devastating attacks before melting back into a population that offered them sanctuary and support. Their weapons were often primitive, mines made from unexploded ordnance, booby traps constructed from bamboo and human waste. But their knowledge of local conditions and their ability to choose the time and place of engagement gave them tactical advantages that technology could not overcome. These signature search and destroy operations captured the US military's growing frustration with an enemy that wouldn't stand still, and the flaws in applying old strategies to a new kind of war. Vast sweeps through suspected territory, produced impressive body counts and volumes of captured equipment, but they also generated civilian casualties and refugee movements that strengthened Viet Cong propaganda, while weakening the South Vietnamese administration that troops were supposedly defending. The Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965 provided both a preview of the tactical innovations that would characterize the Vietnam conflict and a demonstration of the strategic futility that would ultimately doom the effort. When the 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, deployed helicopters to insert personnel directly into hostile territory, they achieved a mobility that conventional infantry could never match. The fierce fighting that followed showed that units could inflict heavy casualties on North Vietnamese regulars when they chose to stand and fight. But the broader lesson of Ia Drang was more troubling. Even devastating tactical victories could not produce strategic progress when the opposition retained the initiative to break contact and disperse before superior firepower could be brought to bear. Helicopter warfare, that iconic image of the Vietnam conflict, represented both the promise and the limitations of technological superiority. The distinctive thump of rotor blades became the soundtrack of a struggle where mobility substituted for territorial control, and where the ability to insert troops anywhere on the battlefield created the illusion of omnipresence without the reality of dominance. The UH-1 Huey helicopters that carried soldiers into landing zones throughout South Vietnam embodied the industrial capacity that had won World War II, but they also revealed the vulnerabilities of complex systems when employed against adversaries who understood that shooting down a single aircraft could achieve psychological effects far exceeding its tactical significance. Counting bodies became the metric of choice, a product of both bureaucratic incentives and the challenge of tracking progress in a war that lacked traditional goals. Since ground could not be held and opposing units could not be decisively engaged, success had to be quantified through the grim arithmetic of casualties inflicted versus casualties sustained. The competition between formations to report higher kill ratios created perverse incentives that encouraged the inflation of statistics and the targeting of non-combatants who could be counted as dead without the inconvenience of weapons recovery or prisoner interrogation. Free fire zones and specified strike zones represented the attempt to solve the problem of distinguishing combatants from civilians in a conflict where such distinctions had largely broken down. By declaring entire areas to be under hostile control and therefore subject to attack without specific target identification, commanders hoped to simplify the rules of engagement while maximizing the effectiveness of firepower. The human cost of these policies fell primarily on rural inhabitants who found themselves trapped between competing sides, subject to attack by either faction, depending on their location and the tactical requirements of the moment. The weapons that troops brought to Vietnam showcased both the achievements and the limitations of mid-20th century technology. The M16 rifle, lighter and more rapid firing than the M14 it replaced, jammed frequently in jungle conditions and required maintenance procedures that proved difficult to implement in field conditions. Artillery and close air support provided devastating firepower when targets could be identified and engaged, but the opposition's skill at camouflage and rapid movement limited opportunities for effective employment. Even the most sophisticated sensors and surveillance equipment could not solve the fundamental problem of an adversary who looked like the population he moved among and who could disappear into tunnels and bunkers that aerial reconnaissance could not detect. South Vietnam's vast tunnel systems, with Chu Chi as their most famous example, revealed the extreme measures the resistance took to counter the technological edge of their enemy. These underground networks, some extending for dozens of miles, provided not just positions, but entire subterranean societies, complete with hospitals, workshops, and command centers. The tunnel rats who volunteered to clear these complexes with pistols and flashlights represented courage of an almost incomprehensible magnitude, while their limited success illustrated the impossibility of defeating an opposition that could literally disappear beneath the earth. Chemical warfare, euphemistically described as herbicide operations, brought industrial agriculture's pest control methods to bear on objectives with consequences that would reverberate for generations. Agent Orange and its chemical cousins stripped millions of acres of jungle canopy, exposing supply routes and base camps while creating moonscapes where nothing could grow for years. The long-term health effects on both local civilians and servicemen would not become apparent until decades later. But the immediate ecological destruction was visible to anyone who flew over the treated areas. The statistics that flowed back to Washington told a story of progress that bore little resemblance to the reality on the ground. Body counts climbed steadily. Weapons caches were discovered and destroyed in impressive numbers, and the percentage of South Vietnamese territory under administration control appeared to increase month by month. But these metrics missed the essential dynamic of the struggle. Every success created new opponents. Every display of firepower generated new recruits for the Viet Cong, and every tactical victory contributed to the strategic stalemate that was slowly eroding public support for the effort. The contrast between approaches to the conflict could not have been more stark. Where commanders sought decisive engagements that would produce measurable results, resistance pursued a strategy of protracted warfare designed to exhaust patience and resources. Where units measured success in terms of casualties inflicted and territory cleared, opposition commanders evaluated progress by their ability to maintain their personnel in the field and their organization in contested areas. Where overwhelming firepower was brought to bear on specific objectives, resistance used time and space to neutralize technological advantages through persistence and mobilization. Life in the field for soldiers reflected these strategic contradictions in ways that no amount of training could have prepared them for. Patrols through seemingly empty countryside could erupt into brief, vicious firefights before subsiding into the humid silence of a landscape that concealed its secrets behind walls of vegetation. The opposition was simultaneously a specific group of armed individuals and an entire population whose loyalties could shift depending on which side seemed to offer the better prospects for survival. Victory meant reaching designated coordinates without casualties, while defeat could come from a sniper's bullet fired from a location that could never be precisely determined. The urban dimension of the conflict, often overlooked in accounts focused on jungle warfare, revealed another aspect of complexity that strategists struggled to comprehend. Cities like Saigon, Da Nang, and Hue became magnets for refugees from the countryside, swelling into chaotic mixtures of traditional culture and Western influence. The bar girls and black marketeers who catered to servicemen represented one face of this urban transformation, while the students and intellectuals who organized anti-administration demonstrations represented another. Both groups reflected the social dislocation that accompanies any society undergoing rapid change under foreign influence. Corruption, that perennial problem of developing societies under stress, reached levels that astonished even officials accustomed to the relaxed ethical standards of Cold War alliances. South Vietnamese officers sold weapons to their opponents, diverted reconstruction funds to personal accounts, and created phantom units that existed only on paper but drew full pay and allowances. Advisors who tried to address these problems found themselves caught, between the need to maintain working relationships with their counterparts and their professional obligations to ensure effective use of resources. By 1967, the contradiction between public optimism and private pessimism had become impossible to maintain. The same officials who briefed congressional delegations about progress and light at the end of the tunnel wrote classified assessments that painted a far darker picture of endless conflict against an adversary whose will to fight showed no signs of diminishing. The credibility gap that emerged from this disconnect would eventually destroy Johnson's presidency and transform attitudes toward their government's truthfulness in matters of national security. The anti-war movement that began to coalesce during this period drew its initial strength not from radical opposition to foreign policy, but from growing skepticism about the competence and honesty of those who were conducting it. The teach-ins that spread across college campuses in 1965 and 1966 featured faculty members who questioned not the right to intervene in Southeast Asia, but the effectiveness of the methods being employed and the credibility of the information being provided to justify continued escalation. International opinion, initially supportive of efforts to contain communist expansion, began to shift as the scope and intensity of the bombing campaign became apparent. The images of destruction that appeared in European and Asian newspapers challenged the narrative of limited, defensive operations that officials had constructed to justify their actions. Even allies who supported objectives questioned the proportionality of the means being employed and worried about the precedents being established for the use of force in international relations. The economic costs of the struggle, initially manageable within the context of the booming economy of the mid-1960s, began to create inflationary pressures that threatened Johnson's domestic agenda. The Great Society programs that were supposed to eliminate poverty and racial injustice found themselves competing with expenditures that consumed an ever-increasing share of federal resources. The guns versus butter dilemma that had confronted previous wartime administrations acquired special poignancy in a conflict whose necessity was increasingly questioned by the people. As 1967 drew to a close, troops in Vietnam had achieved tactical dominance over virtually every battlefield they had chosen to contest. They could insert personnel anywhere in South Vietnam, bring devastating firepower to bear on any target they could identify, and inflict casualties on opposition at ratios that would have guaranteed victory in any conventional engagement. But tactical success had not translated into strategic progress, and strategic progress seemed more elusive with each passing month. The adversary that units faced at the end of 3 years of escalation was more experienced, better equipped, and more sophisticated than the one they had encountered in 1965. North Vietnamese regular formations had learned to fight on terms that minimized advantages while maximizing their own. The Viet Cong infrastructure, despite sustained attack, continued to function effectively throughout much of South Vietnam. Most troubling of all, public support for the struggle was beginning to erode as the costs mounted and the objectives remained frustratingly unclear. They brought jets, tanks, radios, and rifles. The jungle brought silence and knives in the dark. The technological revolution that had transformed society since World War II had met its match in the ancient rhythms of Southeast Asian warfare, where patience mattered more than precision and legitimacy trumped effectiveness. The escalation that had begun with such confidence was approaching the moment when its own internal contradictions would become impossible to ignore, setting the stage for the traumatic reconsiderations that would dominate politics for the remainder of the decade. The year the war exploded, on screens, in streets, and in the souls of soldiers. The Lunar New Year of 1968 dawned across Vietnam with the deceptive tranquility of a tropical morning, the air thick with humidity and the promise of celebration. In Saigon, firecrackers popped like scattered gunshots as families prepared to welcome the Year of the Monkey, while American GIs enjoyed an unofficial ceasefire that had settled over the country like a temporary blessing. Few could have imagined that within hours, this ancient festival would become the backdrop for the most shocking military campaign of the Vietnam conflict. An offensive so audacious in its scope and devastating in its psychological impact that it would transform American perceptions of the struggle and ultimately drive a president from office. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, had spent 2 years planning what would become the most complex operation in Vietnamese history. The strategy that emerged from his deliberations represented a revolutionary departure from the guerrilla tactics that had sustained Vietnamese resistance for decades. Instead of avoiding major urban centers and conventional confrontations, the Tet Offensive would strike simultaneously at over 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, bringing the conflict directly to the doorsteps of those who had considered themselves safely removed from its violence. The preparations for this massive undertaking required organizational skills that surpassed anything the Vietnamese resistance had previously attempted. Weapons and ammunition were smuggled into urban areas over months of painstaking effort, hidden in flower carts, rice shipments, and funeral processions that moved through government checkpoints with the casual familiarity of everyday commerce. Viet Cong operatives who had lived ordinary lives as shopkeepers, students, and cyclo drivers suddenly revealed themselves as trained soldiers and saboteurs, their cover identities dissolving like morning mist to expose a parallel structure that had existed beneath the surface of South Vietnamese society. Beyond the tactical reasoning, the timing of the attack carried cultural resonance that consistently escaped Western comprehension. Tet represented the most sacred period in the Vietnamese calendar, when families reunited and spirits were believed to return from the dead to bless the living. By launching their offensive during this period of universal celebration, Giap and his commissars sought to demonstrate that even the most cherished traditions could not protect the Saigon regime from the reach of revolutionary justice. The first explosions shattered the pre-dawn silence of January 30th, 1968, as Viet Cong sappers launched coordinated strikes across the Mekong Delta and central provinces. By dawn, the scope of the assault had become apparent to American intelligence officers, whose monitoring stations crackled with reports of simultaneous engagements from Da Nang to Can Tho. This was not the scattered harassment that had characterized previous Viet Cong activities, but a synchronized campaign that demonstrated planning capabilities and resource coordination that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of Vietnamese communist organization. Saigon itself became the primary theater for a drama that would unfold before television cameras and international correspondents who found themselves witnesses to urban fighting, unlike anything they had experienced in previous conflicts. The strike on the American embassy, launched by a 19-man Viet Cong team armed with AK-47s and explosive charges, transformed the symbol of American power in Southeast Asia into a battlefield where Marines fought room to room, while reporters ducked behind concrete planters and abandoned automobiles. The images that flickered across television screens in American living rooms that evening carried psychological impact far exceeding their tactical significance. The sight of Viet Cong fighters moving through the embassy compound, their black pajamas and rubber sandals incongruous against the modern architecture of American diplomatic power, challenged official assurances about progress and security, with visual evidence that no amount of statistical manipulation could contradict. For millions of Americans, who had trusted their government's optimistic assessments, the embassy incident provided their first glimpse of a struggle that bore no resemblance to the conflict their leaders had described. Hue, the historic heart of Vietnamese culture, became the setting for the longest and deadliest clash of the campaign. Communist forces, including both Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese regulars, seized most of the city within hours of the initial assault, raising their flag over the citadel and establishing control over neighborhoods that had been considered completely secure by South Vietnamese authorities. The fighting that followed would consume 26 days and reduce much of the city to rubble, while revealing the limitations of American firepower when employed in urban environments where cultural preservation competed with necessity. American and South Vietnamese troops attempting to retake Hue discovered that their overwhelming advantages in artillery and air support became liabilities when deployed against an adversary who had positioned themselves among civilians and cultural monuments that could not be destroyed without inflicting unacceptable collateral damage. The street-by-street, house-by-house struggle that characterized the battle represented a return to the infantry tactics of World War II, where technological superiority meant little and triumph depended on the courage and endurance of individual soldiers advancing under fire. The massacre that communist units perpetrated during their occupation of Hue revealed the ideological ruthlessness that accompanied their actions. Over 3,000 civilians, government officials, teachers, religious leaders, and anyone associated with the Saigon administration were systematically executed and buried in mass graves that would not be discovered until after the city's liberation. These killings, documented with bureaucratic precision by communist officers, demonstrated that beneath the nationalism and anti-imperialist rhetoric lay a revolutionary agenda that brooked no accommodation with those who had collaborated with foreign influence. Television coverage of the offensive brought the reality of Vietnamese fighting into American homes with an immediacy that print journalism could never achieve. The footage of General Nguyen Ngoc alone executing a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street corner, captured by Associated Press photographer Eddie Adams, became one of the defining images of the entire conflict. The split-second moment when Lone's pistol fired, freezing the prisoner's face in an expression of resigned terror, condensed the moral complexity and casual brutality of the struggle into a single frame that would influence American public opinion. More than 1,000 statistical reports about body counts and territorial control. Walter Cronkite's assessment of the offensive, delivered on the CBS Evening News on February 27, 1968, carried weight that transcended journalism and entered the realm of prophecy. The most trusted voice in American news media, speaking with the measured authority that had made him the nation's unofficial anchorman, declared that the conflict had reached a stalemate that could not be resolved through force. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, yet unsatisfactory, conclusion, Cronkite told his audience, his words carrying the weight of personal conviction rather than journalistic neutrality. President Johnson, watching Cronkite's broadcast from the White House, reportedly told his aides, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The comment reflected his understanding that public backing for the struggle had always depended on maintaining confidence in eventual triumph, and that confidence was evaporating under the pressure of evidence that contradicted official optimism. The credibility gap that had been widening since the beginning of American escalation had become an unbridgeable chasm that threatened to destroy his presidency. The assessment of Tet revealed the paradox that would define American perceptions of the offensive for decades to come. By conventional measures, the communist assault had failed catastrophically. with Viet Cong losses estimated at over 40,000 dead, while American and South Vietnamese casualties remained relatively light. The attackers had been driven from every urban center they had seized. Their carefully constructed underground networks had been exposed and destroyed, and their capacity for future activities had been severely degraded. General Westmoreland and other commanders pointed to these statistics as evidence of a decisive American success that had broken the back of communist resistance. What the offensive revealed was far from the official narrative. It proved that communist forces could still coordinate large-scale attacks anywhere in South Vietnam, despite years of military pressure, casting serious doubt on American promises of impending victory. The gap between tactical success and strategic failure exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American involvement. Superiority could not produce achievement when the population being defended remained unconvinced of their government's legitimacy. The domestic response to Tet accelerated changes in American society that extended far beyond opposition to a particular conflict. The anti-war movement, which had been confined largely to college campuses and radical organizations, began to attract mainstream backing from middle-class Americans who had previously accepted official explanations about the necessity and progress of the struggle. The teach-ins and protest marches that had seemed like fringe activities suddenly appeared prophetic, their criticisms validated by events that official spokespersons struggled to explain. The Democratic primary campaign of 1968 became a referendum on Johnson's policies as Senator Eugene McCarthy, and later Robert Kennedy challenged the sitting president with platforms that called for negotiated settlement and American withdrawal. The surprising strength of McCarthy's showing in the New Hampshire primary, where his anti-war message resonated with voters who had backed the effort throughout its escalation, demonstrated that public opinion had shifted in ways that traditional calculations had failed to anticipate. Johnson's withdrawal from the presidential race, announced on March 31st, 1968, in a televised address that shocked the nation, represented the most dramatic casualty of the Tet Offensive. The man who had guided the Great Society through Congress and presided over unprecedented domestic prosperity found himself destroyed by a conflict that had begun as a minor Cold War commitment and evolved into the central issue of American politics. His decision not to seek re-election opened the door for a fundamental reassessment of American foreign policy and the assumptions that had guided it since the end of World War II. When the Paris peace talks began in May 1968, they reflected the new reality Tet had forced into view. Even if they dragged on for another 4 years without real results, the very fact of negotiations represented a tacit acknowledgement that triumph was no longer achievable, while the positions taken by all parties demonstrated that resolution remained as elusive as success. North Vietnam, strengthened by their demonstration of American vulnerability, refused to consider any settlement that did not lead to complete American withdrawal and communist control of South Vietnam. The impact on American morale proved as significant as the repercussions, though it developed more gradually and received less public attention. Soldiers who had been told they were winning against a weakening enemy suddenly found themselves defending positions that had been considered completely secure, while their commanders struggled to explain how an apparently defeated adversary had managed to launch the largest campaign in Vietnamese history. The disconnect between official assessments and battlefield reality eroded confidence in leadership and contributed to the disciplinary problems that would plague American personnel for the remainder of their involvement. Tet gave a sharp boost to international currents that had been simmering since the early days of US escalation, turning slow shifts conflicts into rapid transformations. European allies who had maintained public backing for American objectives, while harboring private doubts about American methods, found themselves under increasing pressure from domestic populations, who viewed the conflict as an example of American imperialism rather than collective defense against communist expansion. The images of urban destruction in Vietnamese cities provided communist propaganda with powerful evidence of American callousness towards civilian casualties. The intelligence failure that Tet represented forced a fundamental reassessment of American understanding of Vietnamese communist capabilities and intentions. The elaborate networks of informants and surveillance that had been constructed to monitor enemy activities had failed to detect preparations for the largest campaign of the struggle, while the intelligence that had assured policymakers of South Vietnamese stability had proven completely inaccurate. The revelation that American intelligence agencies had been systematically overestimating American progress while underestimating enemy capabilities called into question the entire foundation of planning. Media coverage of the offensive established precedents for the relationship between journalism and activities that would influence American conflicts for decades to come. The presence of television cameras in zones created pressures for immediate assessment and interpretation that commanders had never previously experienced, while the graphic nature of the footage challenged traditional assumptions about public backing for endeavors. The tension between operational security and public information that Tet revealed would become a central issue in subsequent American interventions. The human cost of the offensive extended far beyond the immediate casualties, to encompass the psychological trauma of civilians who had experienced urban fighting and soldiers who had witnessed the collapse of their assumptions about the nature of their mission. The refugees who fled the violence in Hue and other cities joined the millions of Vietnamese who had already been displaced by the conflict, while American servicemen who had believed they were protecting a grateful population found themselves questioning the purpose and morality of their involvement. It took time for the full weight of Tet to sink in, as its immediate battlefield results gave way to deeper, long-term shifts. The Viet Cong infrastructure that had been exposed and destroyed during the fighting was never fully rebuilt, forcing North Vietnam to assume greater responsibility for activities in the south while reducing the indigenous character of the resistance movement. This shift toward conventional engagement played to American strengths, while reducing the advantages that guerrilla tactics had provided to Vietnamese communists. The economic impact of the offensive contributed to the inflation and social tensions that would characterize American society throughout the remainder of the decade. The costs of mobilizing reserve units, replacing equipment lost during the fighting, and maintaining force levels in the face of declining public backing strained federal budgets while competing with domestic programs that Johnson had hoped would define his presidential legacy. The guns and butter dilemma that had been manageable during the early phases of escalation became unsustainable after Tet demonstrated that triumph would require indefinite commitment of resources. As the smoke cleared from the battlefields of 1968, both sides could claim elements of success while acknowledging the persistence of stalemate. Vietnamese communists had demonstrated their continued capacity for large-scale campaigns while exposing the vulnerability of American-supported urban centers, but they had paid an enormous price in casualties and organizational capacity. American and South Vietnamese troops had proven their ability to defeat conventional strikes while maintaining control of major population centers, but they had failed to convince either domestic or international audiences that they were winning a struggle that seemed to have no end. Tet was not a triumph for the Viet Cong, but it broke the illusion that America could win. The offensive that began with fireworks and celebration had ended with the recognition that the most powerful force in human history could not impose its will on a people determined to resist foreign domination. The year that had begun with confidence about light at the end of the tunnel concluded with the understanding that the tunnel itself might have no end, leading not towards success, but toward the kind of protracted struggle that would test American resolve in ways that no previous conflict had attempted. The explosion that shattered the pre-dawn silence of Tet had also shattered the assumptions that had sustained American involvement, leaving behind questions about the limits of power and the nature of achievement that would haunt American foreign policy for generations to come. One side left, the other waited. The helicopter that carried Richard Nixon toward his inauguration in January 1969 rose above a Washington landscape transformed by the trauma of the previous year, the city still scarred by riots that had followed Martin Luther King's assassination and the Democratic National Convention that had descended into televised chaos. Below the aircraft, protesters gathered on the National Mall, carried signs demanding immediate withdrawal from Vietnam, their chants barely audible above the rotor blades that would soon deliver a new president who had promised to end the nation's longest war. Nixon understood that his survival depended on fulfilling that promise, but he also knew that the manner of ending would determine whether the country emerged from Southeast Asia with its global credibility intact or suffered a humiliation that would echo through the remainder of the Cold War. Nixon's early decisions revealed a strategy that echoed past approaches, even as it attempted to steer the country in a different direction. Vietnamization, the gradual transfer of combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese troops while maintaining air support and financial assistance, offered the possibility of achieving peace with honor, without the appearance of abandoning an ally to communist conquest. The concept promised to satisfy both hawks who demanded victory and doves who insisted on withdrawal, though its success depended on assumptions about ARVN capabilities that previous experience had done little to validate. General Crichton Abrams, who replaced William Westmoreland as commander of Military Assistance Command Vietnam in June 1968, brought to his position a fundamentally different approach to prosecuting the conflict. Where his predecessor had emphasized large-scale search and destroy operations designed to produce impressive body counts, Abrams focused on smaller unit actions aimed at disrupting enemy logistics and protecting the population centers that Vietnamization required. The shift reflected both the lessons of Tet and the realities of a struggle that could no longer be sustained through escalation. The expansion of the conflict into Cambodia represented Nixon's attempt to buy time for Vietnamization by eliminating the sanctuaries from which northern troops had launched their most devastating attacks on South Vietnam. The secret bombing campaign that began in March 1969 targeted base areas 353 and 609, the elaborate supply and command complexes that had enabled communist units to maintain pressure on Saigon despite years of interdiction efforts. Operation Menu, as the bombing was designated, represented the most intensive aerial campaign in history, with B-52 Stratofortresses dropping over 2.7 million tons of ordnance on targets throughout eastern Cambodia over the next 4 years. It was Cambodian villagers who paid the highest price, caught in the crossfire of a war they hadn't chosen, as bombs leveled their communities in pursuit of invisible foes. The bombing drove hundreds of thousands of refugees into camps around Phnom Penh, while destabilizing the neutral administration of Prince Norodom Sihanouk, whose delicate balancing act between communist and Western pressures had kept Cambodia out of the wider struggle. The irony was cruel and predictable. An operation designed to isolate the Vietnam conflict instead spread it across the entire Indochinese peninsula. Troop withdrawals began in July 1969 with the departure of 25,000 servicemen, the first reduction in force levels since the build-up had begun 4 years earlier. The personnel who left Vietnam carried with them the relief of survival and the bitter knowledge that their sacrifices had achieved no decisive results, while those who remained faced the psychological burden of fighting a struggle that their own leadership had acknowledged could not be won through force. The gradual drawdown created perverse incentives where units competed to avoid being assigned to dangerous operations, while commanders struggled to maintain morale in armies that knew they were being systematically abandoned. The My Lai massacre, revealed to the public by journalist Seymour Hersh in November 1969, provided the most shocking evidence of how the frustrations and moral ambiguities of guerrilla warfare had corrupted conduct. The systematic killing of between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians in the hamlet of My Lai on March 16, 1968, represented not an aberration, but the logical culmination of policies that had defined success through body counts while failing to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Lieutenant William Calley, the only officer ultimately convicted for the massacre, became a scapegoat for systemic failures that extended far beyond individual responsibility. Hersh's reporting was reinforced by haunting images. Old men and women collapsed in ditches, children strewn like shattered dolls, confirming the worst suspicions about America's actions in the war. The gap between official rhetoric about protecting democracy and the reality of soldiers murdering civilians could not be bridged by explanations about the fog of combat or the pressures of counterinsurgency campaigns. My Lai became a symbol of moral corruption that no amount of contextual analysis could rehabilitate. The anti-war movement that had struggled for legitimacy throughout the 1960s found itself vindicated by revelations that transformed popular perceptions of conduct in Vietnam. The moratorium demonstrations of October 15, 1969, brought over 2 million people into the streets in the largest coordinated protest in the nation's history, while the March on Washington the following month demonstrated that opposition to the conflict had moved far beyond radical student groups to encompass mainstream middle-class citizens who had previously backed administration policy. Nixon's response to domestic opposition combined tactical concessions with strategic defiance, acknowledging the necessity of ending involvement while refusing to accept the appearance of defeat that immediate withdrawal would entail. His appeal to the silent majority who supposedly backed continued prosecution of the struggle represented an attempt to mobilize conservative opinion against the vocal minority that dominated media coverage of anti-war activities. The speech delivered on November 3, 1969, succeeded in temporarily stabilizing public backing for administration policy while buying time for Vietnamization to demonstrate its effectiveness. Whatever domestic consensus Nixon had forged around controlled withdrawal was undone when US forces moved into Cambodia in May 1970. The decision to send troops across the border in pursuit of the Central Office for South Vietnam, COSVN, the elusive communist headquarters that intelligence claimed to control all enemy activities in the South, represented both the culmination of frustration and a fundamental misunderstanding of how communist organization actually functioned. The protests that erupted across college campuses in response to the Cambodian invasion demonstrated the volatility of public opinion and the limits of presidential authority in a democratic society engaged in an unpopular struggle. The killing of 4 students at Kent State University by Ohio National Guardsmen on May 4, 1970, provided the anti-war movement with martyrs whose deaths could not be explained away as the unfortunate consequences of necessary action. The images of Jeffrey Miller lying in a pool of blood while a young woman knelt beside his body became as iconic as any photograph from the Vietnam battlefield itself. Starting in June 1971, the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers, uncovering a trail of deliberate misdirection that had defined policymaking during the 1960s escalation. The secret study, commissioned by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, provided documentary evidence that officials had privately acknowledged the futility of their approach, while publicly expressing confidence about progress and eventual victory. The gap between internal assessments and public statements proved even wider than critics had suspected, confirming that the credibility gap was not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate strategy of misinformation. Daniel Ellsberg's decision to leak the Pentagon Papers represented both personal moral crisis and institutional failure. The choice of a defense analyst who had concluded that only public exposure of classified information could halt policies that he had helped to create. The legal battle that followed pitted claims about national security against press freedom and the public's right to know, establishing precedents that would influence journalism and democracy for decades to come. Nixon's overreaction to the leak, including the creation of the Plumbers Unit that would ultimately destroy his presidency, demonstrated how the Vietnam conflict corrupted not just policy, but the fundamental relationships between branches of authority. The transformation of South Vietnamese armies under Vietnamization proceeded unevenly, with some units demonstrating impressive capabilities, while others collapsed under pressure from experienced northern adversaries. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, expanded from 514,000 personnel in 1968 to over 1.1 million by 1972, becoming one of the largest armed organizations in the world, while remaining dependent on air support, logistics, and intelligence for effective operations. The contradiction between quantitative expansion and qualitative limitations would prove decisive when communist troops tested South Vietnamese resolve in conventional battles that helicopters and advisors could not win. North Vietnam's Easter Offensive, launched on March 30th, 1972, marked a shift in strategy, an effort to win through conventional warfare what years of guerrilla fighting hadn't delivered. The three-pronged assault across the DMZ, through the Central Highlands and from Cambodia towards Saigon, employed over 120,000 northern soldiers, backed by tanks, artillery, and surface-to-air missiles, that demonstrated the transformation of Ho Chi Minh's guerrilla army into a modern organization capable of engaging Western-equipped enemies in set-piece battles. Despite years of support and preparation, Southern troops still showed serious weaknesses, as the communist offensive quickly captured Quang Tri and advanced on An Loc and Kontum. ARVN formations that had performed adequately in small-scale activities collapsed when faced with coordinated attacks by experienced northern divisions, while their commanders proved incapable of the flexible thinking that modern warfare demanded. Only massive bombing, including the resumption of strikes on North Vietnam that had been suspended since 1968, prevented the complete collapse of South Vietnamese resistance. Operation Linebacker 2, the Christmas bombings of December 1972, represented Nixon's final attempt to compel Northern compliance with terms for ending the struggle. The 12-day campaign sent waves of B-52 Stratofortresses over Hanoi and Haiphong in round-the-clock attacks that brought the full weight of strategic air power to bear on targets that had been off-limits throughout most of the conflict. The bombing achieved its immediate objective of bringing Northern negotiators back to the Paris peace talks, but at the cost of international condemnation and domestic criticism that further eroded backing for administration policy. Signed on January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords allowed Nixon to claim peace with honor. Even as they handed North Vietnam nearly all it had been asking for since talks began 5 years earlier. The agreement called for the complete withdrawal of US personnel within 60 days, while allowing northern armies to remain in position throughout South Vietnam, creating conditions that made eventual communist victory almost inevitable. The prisoner exchange that accompanied the accords brought 591 POWs home to ticker tape parades. But it could not obscure the reality that the United States was abandoning an ally whose survival depended entirely on continued Western backing. The conflict that continued after withdrawal demonstrated the hollowness of Vietnamization and the fundamental weakness of the South Vietnamese state that no amount of aid could remedy. Congressional restrictions on bombing and the reduction of assistance created a crisis of confidence that spread throughout southern society, while northern armies used the respite provided by the peace agreement to rebuild their strength and prepare for the final offensive that would reunify the country under communist control. As Watergate overtook Nixon's presidency, it closed the door on any serious prospect of renewed American intervention in response to violations of the Paris agreements. The constitutional crisis that led to Nixon's resignation in August 1974 left foreign policy in the hands of Gerald Ford, an unelected president who lacked both the capital and the public backing necessary to honor commitments to South Vietnamese survival. The irony was complete. The deceptions and illegal activities that had grown out of Vietnam policies ultimately destroyed the presidency that had created them. On January 6, 1975, the final northern push began with attacks on Phuoc Long, probing for resistance and finding little in return. When no response materialized, communist commanders understood that they faced only southern resistance in the climactic campaign that would determine Vietnam's future. The strategy that emerged from Hanoi's deliberations called for a 2-year campaign that would systematically destroy ARVN capabilities while building toward the decisive battle for Saigon. But events would unfold far more rapidly than even the most optimistic communist planners had anticipated. The collapse of southern resistance proceeded with stunning speed as psychological factors proved more decisive than capabilities. The retreat from the Central Highlands that began in March 1975 turned into a rout when ARVN units abandoned their equipment and fled toward the coast, their panic spreading to civilian populations who joined the exodus in columns that stretched for miles along highways clogged with refugees and abandoned vehicles. The ancient imperial capital of Hue fell without a fight as its defenders disappeared into the crowds of civilians streaming toward Da Nang and other coastal cities. President Nguyen Van Thieu's decision to abandon the northern provinces in order to concentrate around Saigon reflected both necessity and desperation. But it also became a self-fulfilling prophecy that destroyed morale throughout southern society. The strategy of trading space for time required a level of popular confidence and discipline that 20 years of warfare had failed to create, while the abandonment of major cities sent signals about reliability that no amount of official reassurance could counteract. In its closing days, the Republic of Vietnam resembled a Greek tragedy. The ending was inevitable, but the anguish was no less real for those who had risked everything on the belief that the South would hold. The helicopter evacuations from Saigon that began on April 29, 1975, provided television audiences around the world with images of power in retreat, desperate locals clinging to helicopter skids, Marine guards pushing people from embassy walls, aircraft being shoved off carrier decks to make room for more refugees fleeing the communist advance. The photograph of the last helicopter departing from the embassy roof on April 30th, 1975, captured both the end of involvement and the abandonment of those who had trusted commitments. The tank that crashed through the gates of the presidential palace later that morning, carrying the flag of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, symbolized not just victory, but the triumph of will over technology, patience over power, and revolutionary determination over imperial ambition. In the end, the Americans just went home. The fire stayed behind, and the jungle watched it all. In the end, the most powerful force in human history had been defeated not by superior weapons or brilliant strategy, but by the simple refusal of the people to accept permanent foreign domination of their homeland. The lesson would resonate through the corridors of power in Washington for generations to come, a reminder that technology could not substitute for legitimacy, and that even superpowers had limits that smaller nations could exploit through persistence, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief in the justice of their cause. After April 30th, 1975, Vietnam entered a new phase, one shaped by the echoes of 3 decades of war and the hope for peace, which would prove just as hard to secure as the victory that came before it. The reunification of Vietnam under communist rule would bring new challenges and tragedies, but it would also fulfill the dream of independence that had sustained resistance since the first French gunboats had appeared in Saigon harbor more than a century earlier. The circle that had begun with colonial domination had closed with national liberation, though the cost in human suffering had been almost beyond calculation or comprehension. As May 1st, 1975, dawned over Saigon, the silence was heavy, filled with the memory of a war-torn past and the fragile hope of a long-sought national reunion. In the presidential palace where Nguyen Van Thieu had fled just days before, communist officials moved through rooms still warm with the breath of departed power, their rubber sandals clicking against marble floors that had once echoed with the confident footsteps of advisors and South Vietnamese generals. Outside, the streets lay empty except for abandoned equipment and the occasional cyclist navigating between burned-out vehicles, while overhead, the flag of the Provisional Revolutionary Government snapped in the humid breeze that carried the scent of cordite and tropical flowers in equal measure. Though Ho Chi Minh didn't live to see it, the victory he had dreamed of was both the fulfillment of nationalist aspirations and the start of a difficult journey to turn that success into lasting social progress. The leadership that gathered in the former presidential palace faced the daunting task of governing a country that had been physically devastated by 3 decades of fighting, socially fragmented by competing ideologies, and economically dependent on wartime industries that would disappear with the return of calm. The ease of triumph had masked the complexity of reconstruction, while the unity forged in opposition to foreign occupation would prove more difficult to maintain in the mundane work of building a socialist society from the ruins of struggle. For years, leaders had managed the narrative, but with the fighting over, the truth, long suppressed, began to break through the cracks. The ecological destruction wrought by chemical defoliants had transformed vast areas of South Vietnam into wasteland where nothing would grow for generations, while unexploded ordnance buried in rice paddies and schoolyards would continue killing farmers and children decades after the last helicopter had departed. Agent Orange, that chemical nightmare disguised as necessity, had poisoned not only the environment but the genetic heritage of millions whose children would bear the scars of a struggle they had never seen. More than ruined forests and poisoned rivers, it was the shattered lives that told the most painful story. Conservative estimates placed casualties at over 3 million dead and countless more wounded, while the psychological trauma extended to virtually every family in the country. The fighting had created over 900,000 orphans, 1.5 million widows, and millions of refugees whose displacement had shattered traditional social structures that had sustained civilization for millennia. The cities swollen by wartime migration faced the impossible challenge of reintegrating populations that had lost their connection to the land, while rural areas struggled to absorb the return of residents who had been transformed by urban experience. Though communist forces had won through discipline and a fierce drive for independence, their triumph soon ran up against the hard realities of rebuilding an economy. The socialist model that had inspired resistance to foreign domination proved inadequate to the challenge of feeding a population that had grown dependent on food imports, while the centrally planned economy that worked effectively for purposes struggled to meet the complex needs of a society attempting to transition from warfare to peaceful advancement. Land reform, the centerpiece of communist social policy, proceeded with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized operations, but with results that often contradicted revolutionary intentions. The redistribution of agricultural holdings that had belonged to landlords and collaborators with the former regime provided landless peasants with the economic security that had been denied them under colonial and capitalist exploitation. Yet the collectivization campaigns that followed revealed the tension between ideological purity and agricultural productivity, as farmers who had fought for individual ownership found themselves absorbed into cooperative structures that subordinated personal initiative to collective goals. The re-education camps that housed former South Vietnamese officials, officers, and anyone else deemed unreliable became symbols of the revolution's determination to eliminate all traces of the old order. These facilities, euphemistically described as schools for enlightenment, confined an estimated 300,000 people in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to brutal, depending on the perceived threat that inmates posed to the new regime. The irony was bitter. A revolution that had promised liberation from foreign oppression created its own system of imprisonment for those whose only crime had been choosing the wrong side in a civil struggle that had torn the country apart for a generation. Within months of the communist victory, the exodus of the boat people became a stark sign that the revolution had fallen short of the national unity Ho Chi Minh once imagined. The exodus that started as a trickle of wealthy Chinese merchants and former officials soon became a flood of refugees representing every segment of southern society. These desperate souls, fleeing in overcrowded fishing boats and improvised rafts, faced storms, pirates, and mechanical failure in journeys that killed an estimated 200,000 to 400,000 people, while traumatizing survivors who reached refugee camps in Thailand, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. Responses to the refugees laid bare a dual reality: genuine concern for human lives and the careful maneuvering of Cold War politics. Western nations that had opposed communist victory found themselves morally obligated to accept refugees fleeing the consequences of that victory, while Southeast Asian countries struggled to accommodate populations that strained their resources and threatened their ethnic balance. The resettlement programs that eventually absorbed over 1 million refugees transformed nationalism from a geographically contained phenomenon into a worldwide diaspora that would influence politics for decades to come. The economic isolation that accompanied communist victory compounded the challenges facing Reconstruction. The trade embargo imposed by the United States and its allies cut Vietnam off from the markets and technological transfers that rapid development required, while the country's alignment with the Soviet bloc provided security at the cost of economic dependence on a system that was already showing signs of internal strain. The aid that flowed from Moscow and its Eastern European satellites helped maintain basic services, but could not substitute for the dynamic capitalism that was transforming other Asian economies during the same period. Victory over the US didn't guarantee peace. The border conflicts that followed showed how quickly ideological unity could give way to historic distrust. The invasion of Cambodia, launched on December 25, 1978, represented Vietnam's attempt to eliminate the Khmer Rouge regime that had been conducting genocidal campaigns against its own people while launching cross-border raids that threatened border provinces. The decision to intervene in Cambodia reflected both humanitarian concerns and strategic necessities, but it also committed Vietnam to a decade-long occupation that would drain resources needed for domestic reconstruction. China's reaction to Vietnam's move into Cambodia exposed how quickly communist unity unraveled when national interests and old grudges came into play. The 17-day confrontation that China launched against Vietnam in February 1979 ostensibly aimed to teach Vietnam a lesson about respecting Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, but it actually demonstrated the persistence of the territorial and cultural disputes that had divided the two countries for over a millennium. The fighting along the northern border, though brief, reminded leaders that victory over one superpower did not guarantee security against threats from neighboring powers with their own imperial ambitions. The legacy of involvement in Vietnam extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence relations and domestic politics throughout the world. The defeat of the most powerful force in human history by a Third World revolutionary movement inspired liberation struggles from Central America to Southern Africa, while providing communist movements everywhere with proof that determined resistance could overcome apparently overwhelming technological advantages. The methods that forces had pioneered in fighting a superpower became templates for asymmetric warfare that would be studied and adapted by insurgent movements for generations to come. Within the United States, the trauma of defeat created a syndrome of reluctance to commit forces overseas that would influence foreign policy decisions throughout the remainder of the Cold War. The Vietnam syndrome that haunted strategic thinking reflected not just the practical lessons about the limitations of power, but also the psychological impact of a struggle that had challenged fundamental assumptions about righteousness and invincibility. The bitter divisions that the hostilities had created within society would take decades to heal, while the questions it raised about the relationship between democracy and foreign policy would continue to influence debate long after the last veteran had returned home. This confrontation left its mark not only on the countries that fought it, but also on the wider world that experienced the war through television and the press. The images of helicopter evacuations, napalm strikes, and civilian casualties had created a new visual vocabulary for understanding modern warfare, while the protest movements that the struggle had inspired established precedents for popular opposition to policies that would influence democratic politics worldwide. The music, literature, and art that emerged from the experience provided cultural frameworks for processing trauma and loss that would be applied to subsequent conflicts and social upheavals. What began as tools for combat were later repurposed in factories, cities, and new theaters of war, with consequences no one had fully predicted. The helicopter mobility that had characterized operations became standard doctrine for modern armies, while the electronic surveillance and communication systems that had been tested in Southeast Asian jungles provided the foundation for the information warfare capabilities that would dominate thinking in the following decades. The chemical agents that had been used for defoliation contributed to the development of herbicides and pesticides that would revolutionize agriculture while creating new environmental challenges. Lessons learned from treating wounds and illnesses in tropical war zones led to breakthroughs in trauma care, medicine, and mental health that later improved lives far beyond the battlefield. The understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder that developed from studying veterans provided frameworks for treating survivors of natural disasters, criminal violence, and other forms of psychological trauma. The prosthetic devices and rehabilitation techniques that had been developed for amputees and disabled veterans found applications in civilian medicine that improved the quality of life for millions of people who had never experienced service. The diplomatic precedents established during the confrontation influenced law and the conduct of foreign relations in ways that extended far beyond Southeast Asia. The Paris peace talks that had lasted for over 4 years demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of multilateral diplomacy in resolving complex disputes, while the various ceasefire agreements and prisoner exchanges provided templates for ending other conflicts. The role of media coverage in shaping public opinion about operations established new parameters for the relationship between democratic governments and their citizens during wartime. Damage to the land and ecosystems became a turning point, elevating environmental concerns into a serious part of political discourse and policymaking. The widespread use of chemical defoliants had demonstrated the vulnerability of natural ecosystems to modern technology, while the bombing campaigns that had cratered vast areas of countryside revealed the long-term costs of intensive warfare in densely populated regions. The lessons learned about environmental destruction influenced subsequent agreements about chemical weapons and environmental protection during armed conflicts. The refugee crisis that followed communist victory established precedents for cooperation in addressing mass population movements that would be applied to subsequent humanitarian emergencies throughout the world. The resettlement programs that had absorbed boat people provided models for dealing with refugees from other conflicts, while the camps that had housed displaced persons in Southeast Asia became prototypes for the refugee facilities that would be established in response to hostilities and natural disasters in other regions. With costs surpassing $120 billion by 1975, the economic burden of the war fed into the broader financial pressures that weakened America's global standing in the years that followed. The inflation that had been fueled by wartime spending, without corresponding tax increases, created economic instabilities that would influence domestic politics for the rest of the decade, while the opportunity costs of resources devoted to purposes rather than social programs contributed to the urban decay and educational deficiencies that would plague society for generations. By 1979, the immediate crisis phase of post-struggle reconstruction had passed, though the fundamental challenges facing society remained as daunting as ever. The unified Vietnam that emerged from 30 years of fighting bore little resemblance to the prosperous, independent nation that Ho Chi Minh had envisioned when he first proclaimed independence in 1945. The price of victory had been almost beyond calculation. Millions of dead, an environment poisoned by chemical warfare, an economy dependent on foreign aid, and a society divided by the trauma of civil strife and revolutionary transformation. Yet the achievement remained undeniable. For the first time in nearly a century, Vietnam was governed by leaders who answered to interests rather than foreign powers. The independence that had cost so much to achieve provided the foundation for whatever future the people would create for themselves, free from the interference of colonial administrators, advisors, and ideological missionaries who had imposed their visions on society for so long. The silence that had settled over Saigon in May 1975 would gradually give way to the sounds of reconstruction. Hammers rebuilding homes destroyed by fighting, school children reciting lessons in unified curricula, and farmers returning to fields that had been battlegrounds. The calm that had seemed so elusive during 3 decades of struggle would prove as difficult to achieve as the victory that had preceded it. But it would also offer possibilities that no amount of foreign assistance or intervention could have provided. In the end, the people had won more than a struggle. They had reclaimed their right to determine their own destiny, however difficult that path might prove to be. The cost had been enormous, the suffering almost unbearable, but the alternative, permanent subjugation to foreign control, had been unacceptable to a people whose history had taught them that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The fighting was over, but the real work of building a nation from the ashes of confrontation was just beginning.